Hi everyone, welcome. I'm Carolyn Tory, Managing Director at Aspen Words, and I'm here on behalf of our team to welcome you to this virtual Summer Words panel on writing about real people. Now I know there's some new people joining us tonight, so quickly I'll tell you a bit about Aspen Words. We're a literary arts nonprofit based in Colorado, and our mission is to encourage writers, inspire readers, and connect people through stories. That mission is feeling especially vital right now as so many are feeling isolated and just aching for connection through stories and literary community. So thank you for being a part of that community and participating with us tonight. We also want to acknowledge the important role that we must play, both as individuals and as a literary organization, in the racial reckoning that is happening in our country right now. We've been fortunate in this series of panels to hear great conversations covering everything from diversity and equity in the publishing industry to examining our own biases in our writing. Through the lens of literature, we're looking forward to continuing to hold space for those conversations, and we hope you'll join us. So before I introduce our panelists, I just have a few quick housekeeping items to go over with you. We'll use the chat feature to post links to the full panelist bios, and we will also try to link to any articles or books that are mentioned during the conversation. Right now, you'll see a link go up to our virtual bookshelf on bookshop.org, and that has books by all of the panelists tonight for sale, as well as titles from our other Summer Words authors available. A percentage of all book sales go to our local indie Explore booksellers. The panelists will be in conversation for about 40 minutes, and then we'll open it up to audience questions. You can use the Q&A function in the toolbar at the bottom of your screen to submit questions at any point in the conversation, and we'll get to as many of them as we can at the end. There is no charge to enjoy any of these virtual events, which are taking place instead of our usual ticketed events in Aspen. So we do need your support to continue to sustain literary arts programming like this. So if you're in a position to give, we've posted a link to our donation page in the chat. Many of you have already contributed, and we're so grateful. Thank you. And now it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speakers. Our moderator is Adrienne Brodeur, Executive Director at Aspen Words and author of the best-selling memoir, Wild Game. The paperback pub date is July 7th, so look out for that. Our panelists are Steve Almond, author of 10 books of fiction and nonfiction, including the New York Times bestsellers Candyfreak and Against Football. We have Christopher Castellani, author of 4 critically acclaimed novels, including his most recent novel, Leading Men. He is also artistic director of the Grub Street Creative Writing Center. We have Claire Bidwell Smith, grief expert and the internationally renowned author of 3 books of nonfiction. Thank you all for being here virtually with us, and I'll turn it over to you, Adrienne.
Okay, thank you, Carolyn, and welcome everyone who has zoomed into this conversation, and greeting panelists. What's really great about this particular group of writers is that between the 3 of them, they've written about 20 books and covered just about every humanly possible way to write about real people. So their work includes memoir and self-help and personal essays and other forms of creative nonfiction, and fiction based on the historical lives of real/famous people, and fiction that's been inspired by their own experiences, and journalism. So you name it, they have it covered. I don't think anyone's written a biography, but otherwise. So let's dive right in to the murky territory of writing about real people's lives. And I'd like to start with a couple of big sort of broad questions that I hope you can all chime in on, and then I'll sort of narrow down to some author specific questions. But the first one is this: are there overarching rules that you personally follow when you write about real people? And Steve, why don't we start with you and then go to Claire and then Christopher?
Yes, there's one kind of overarching rule that I use. I mean, let's just start by saying there's a lot of anxiety that doesn't get talked about, at least in my MFA program, it didn't get talked about, that just arises from the fact that, like, people will sometimes say, oh, I don't write autobiographical work. And I'm just like, take it somewhere else, pal. Everybody, Holden Caulfield didn't just pop out of J.D. Salinger's head. Sula didn't just pop out of Toni Morrison's head. You write, whether it's in fictional disguise or not, about the deepest preoccupations and anxieties and dynamics and relationships that you have in your life. So there's always a certain amount of exposure anxiety when it comes to even writing fiction. And Adrienne, you and I know that. I wrote some stories back in the day for Zoetrope that, we both know that some of those were based on real life. And so there's a real question about, are you honoring the material? And the only kind of overarching rule that I have is, like, proceed, you have to aim for the truth, and you have to proceed toward the truth with mercy. That's kind of your only hedge against the inevitable disruption that you're going to cause in people's lives, some of whom you love and care about, when you do the business of truth telling in your writing, whether it's fiction or nonfiction. And the only other thing I try to do, which isn't a rule, but is sort of I guess an ideal, is I want to be the central character or person or moral actor that I interrogate in my work. When you're grinding an axe, the reader picks up on it very quickly. And when you try to flatten out a real complicated person into an antagonist, not only is it unconvincing, it's dramatically unsatisfying. So I'm always, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, saying, how did I screw up? What was my role in all this? I know I am not the victim or the hero exclusively, probably not even minorly in most of the stories that I tell. And that's one way of dealing with that anxiety of just exposing your inner life and the lives of the people around you.
Yeah. That's a great response. Claire, what about you?
A couple of things. I've written a memoir, so I wrote about a lot of people in that book. Some of them were living, some of them were not. And then I've written 2 books of nonfiction that were more self-help, but I wrote about client experiences. And in that case, I had to do some composites and some disguising. But in terms of memoir writing, one of my big rules is to never write from a place of revenge. Never write from a place where you're hurting and wanting to hurt someone else. And that's something I talk to students about a lot, that I kind of come across. I remember in my first book, my memoir, I had written a story about my aunt, and I had just this tiny scene where one night she just was kind of drinking and she said something not very nice about my mother. And there was a tiny note from my editor there that said, do you really need this there? I think it's going to be hurtful and I don't think it furthers the story. And it really stopped me in my tracks, because I realized it didn't further the story in any way. It didn't lend to the material. I was still just hurting from that moment and that night. And so I think about it all the time when I'm writing about other people. The other thing I'll say is that you're never going to make everybody happy. So a lot of students that I work with, they're writing trying to safekeep somebody, and it's just impossible. All the people that I thought were going to be upset with my book loved it, and all the people I thought were going to be okay with it hated it and don't talk to me anymore. So it's like you can't win in some cases. And I think, like Steve says, you have to write from this place of your truth and your experience, and just think about all of those things.
Yeah, I mean, just to build on what Steve and Claire both said, I mean, I think, there is this thing called story truth, right? Which is the logic and the truth and the insight and the psychological dynamics of the story that you're telling. And that is always going to be separate from whatever the real truth is outside. So if you're writing a story about your mother or your family or about a real person who actually existed, there are these various types of truth that are attached to those people that exist outside the story. But within the world of the story, there is, there is a logic to their psychologies, to their behaviors, to what they say and do, that is actually the thing you have to be the most true to. And I think this is what, Steve was saying as well, that once you kind of put these characters on the page, your loyalty is to them, and to whatever they become in the process of imagining and reimagining them, it's not to whoever they were inspired by or based on, even when they have the same name, right? So if I'm writing about a real person who existed and I make them into a character in fiction, that character is always going to be an interpretation, my interpretation of that character. And the last thing I'll say is, when you're writing about, like when I've tried to write about my own experiences, whether, in fiction, something that's happened to me, and I think, oh, that'll make a great story, and I'll make me into a character, and I'll try to represent it exactly as it happened to me, because I have all that information, right? I lived it. It always fails for me, because I'm a, living, breathing person, and I see all the complexities of what happened to me and what I went through, and you can't possibly represent all those layers of complexity, I think, in fiction. Fiction is always going to be just black marks on white paper. You can be the greatest writer who's ever lived, and you'll never be able to recreate in all its complexity something that happened to you. So I always advise students, actually, when they're writing about something that happened to them, to change something fundamental about the experience, whether change the type of character it was, the time period, the gender, something fundamental, to create a kind of a gap that you have to fill in with your imagination. And that actually weirdly gets you closer to the truth of the thing that happened to you, rather than further away from it.
Right.
That's such good advice. Well, how do you go about giving yourself permission to write about people? And this might not apply so much to you, Christopher, but how do you go about giving yourself permission to write about people who might not relish the idea of being a character in your book? I mean, Tennessee Williams can't say no.
Thank God.
I mean, so what do you do? How do you do that? Do you just fictionalize them enough?
Well, you should talk a little bit about that, Adrienne. I mean, really, you could speak to that. And you know what I mean? What was your journey to saying, okay, I'm going to write this big, complicated, messy story?
You mean of my recent memoir?
Yeah.
Yeah, you're turning the tables here.
I was going to say,
I am, because I want to hear the answer.
I do too.
I do too.
I have right next to me. I'm dying to know.
Of all people, I am in control here. Okay, giving yourself permission. I mean, I felt, I guess in answering that, I always felt that it was my story. And then I followed pretty much all of the advice that you said before, which is I tried to tell it as truthfully as possible. I tried to be as hard on myself as I was on anyone else. I definitely tried not to settle any scores or have a chip. So it was really a very specific exploration of a complicated relationship I had with my own mother. But I wanted to show her in all her full dimensions. I didn't want to make her a monster and me just the sweet victim, as you pointed out before. So yeah, but it was hard to give myself permission, and the concern we all have about the collateral damage and the people around the immediate people. I mean, I felt quite fine about my mother and me because I had talked to her about it, but then, the rippling out of, the kids of the stepfathers and the kids of the stepmothers and all of those types of things. It's a huge thing to kind of grapple with.
Right.
Now, on you.
Well, I'll say that I think it's probably significant, maybe Adrienne, you could speak to this, that you might not have written that memoir, certainly wouldn't have written it in the same way in your 20s,
No.
In your early 30s. So it's by way of saying, people will sometimes say, essentially your question, how do you give yourself permission? And the answer is, well, a little bit at a time. And you develop the realization that if you're going to be a storyteller, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, you are dealing in emotional exposure. That is what you're doing. If you're going to tell the truth and it's any good, it's going to be painful. Yeah. And there are going to be people, and there's nobody who can give you the fairy dust to say you're allowed to write about this. That has to come from inside. Trust me, if I had that fairy dust, I would bathe in it. But there's still plenty of stuff that I won't touch, but I'm working towards it. And part of the way that I give myself permission is to say, I'm more interested in my own iniquity, my own hypocrisy, my own blind spots, and frankly, my own doubt and uncertainty than I am in sort of being the voice of assurance about anything. And you know, the world right now especially is full of these voices of total assurance about everything, and it's just moral depravity. That's what it leads to. The writer's job is to complicate our experience and to complicate people's moral, you know, to sort of make them feel involved in other people's suffering. And once you're doing that, to whatever extent, at least for me, I've been able to say, all right, I'm allowed to at least try. And part of it is in stages as well, because you write a draft and that doesn't have to go out into the world. You have to trust that you yourself will see places where you're being unfair or exploitative in the work. And then fortunately, you know, Claire mentioned a moment where a good editor will step in and say, you know what, you don't need that. That's not serving the story. It's serving a grievance that you're still bearing. So you just have to trust that your job is to tell the truth, aim for the truth, proceed with mercy, and let yourself at least do that initially. Later on, you can worry about how is it going to move out into the world and who's going to be affected by it, because I think you're right. People are going to be affected. Maybe not the people you expect, but people are going to be affected if it's any good.
I love that line, proceed with mercy. That's just a good one to think about. So I think right now I'll go into some more author-specific questions, and maybe Claire, I'll start with you, memoirist to memoirist. But in your books, as you mentioned before, you tell, you know, your own deeply personal stories. But in the process, of course, you also discussed, you know, the lives of your parents who are both deceased, your ex-husband, which is always tricky territory, your children, which is so delicate, and how do you decide what's okay for yourself? I mean, just how do you decide who you can include in telling your own story?
I think a lot about the message I want the book to have, or the story, or the narrative. And so what's the end takeaway? And everything that I write, I ask, you know, does this further that? Does this lend to that message? And if it doesn't, if it feels extraneous and is just me going on about something or talking from a place of hurt or catharsis or whatever it is I'm writing from, then I know it doesn't need to be in there. All of my books I'm writing, really trying to help. All of my books are about grief and loss. I'm really trying to help people feel comfortable in their own pain and journeys of grief and loss. So I'm always trying to write from that place. And I feel like one of the things that's most helpful about coming to terms with your own grief and loss is feeling less alone in it. So in that, it does take some revealing. Even as a grief therapist, I will reveal more of myself than most therapists will, because I think it's really helpful for someone to know that I've walked in those shoes and that path. And I kind of try to do the same thing with my writing. But, you know, I feel like I haven't been able to make the final call until the book is done, because I think sometimes when you're writing about people, when it's taken out of context, it can seem really eviscerating. And then when it's in a larger context and in this whole, encapsulated in this whole story, it's very, very different. So sometimes I've had to write through a lot of that doubt or wonder and just work through it until I get to the end and can see how it fits into this larger narrative that I've written. And sometimes I can realize that I need to take pieces out, or that it really is okay to have in there, even if it's harsh truths.
Yeah. And even, but do you think at all about, like, even, I mean, I think about this with my own children, because I know you've included your children in it. And as they're getting older, them either being, you know, in the same way that they might be with social media, no, you can't take my picture now, no, you can't talk about me now. I mean, do you get that at all with your children, or not yet?
Yeah, I mean, my first daughter was only 2 when this book came out. I was pregnant and nursing her as a baby when I wrote my memoir. So I wasn't thinking about who she is now. She just turned 11, and it's a very different experience. And I've now been divorced from my first husband. I'm remarried. There's a memoir I would love to write that I don't think I can. You know, there's too many people's lives at stake. And I don't feel like it's okay for me to put their stories out in the world. As much as I would want to, I don't think there's a way that's possible for me to write mine without bringing in and making some things public that they would be uncomfortable with. Right. So I think a lot about that. And maybe I'll write it anyway and put it in a drawer, or maybe I'll write it and get to the end of it and be like, fuck them. Sorry.
Have you ever considered, or how much do you believe you can alter and still call it memoir? Like, have you done the either compressing of time or composite characters? Do you do any of that as a way to accomplish some of those things?
I haven't really. I've changed names and identifying characteristics, but other than that, not really much. I really do want to just kind of try to stick to my true experience and what I remember. I'll write things like, I'll use phrases like, this is how I remember it, or this was my experience of that relationship, or this was my experience of that incident, you know, just kind of trying to know and let it, you know, be understood that it was very much mine and not necessarily what they would remember.
Right, right, of course. And then, I mean, I get this one a lot, but the whole idea that you can't really fact check memories, and what do you do when someone remembers something quite differently from you? And maybe you already answered that in your previous question just by saying this is my version of this, but.
I think the idea of memory and this whole conversation with memoir and memory is fascinating. I'm really interested in the distillation of memory. So while I'm a copious journal writer and, you know, record keeper, I often don't look back at things until I've written what it is I want to say. And then maybe I'll go check and see what the notes were from 5 years ago or 20 years ago. I remember Dani Shapiro talking about writing about the same incident about 20 years apart in 2 different books. And she wrote 20 years later, she wrote the same scene without looking back. And then after she'd written it, she went to check and look in her first book to see what she'd written. And while the action items happened, you know, she walked into a room, she heard a diagnosis, the time of day was different, what she was wearing was different, the gender of the person who talked to her was different. And what she said that was so interesting was she wasn't sure which was the real memory. You know, and that's fascinating to me, you know, so I like just thinking about and using those phrases. This is how I remember it. You know, these are the pieces that come back to me when I look at that time.
It reminds me of a conversation I had several years ago with Darren Strauss, who was talking about his book. And he said that his mother was terribly upset because she was in fact at this funeral, which he wrote about, where he said she wasn't, like it was notable that she wasn't there. And she demonstrated to him that he was, so he decided to try to revise it to include her. But the fact is, it wasn't his memory. Like he didn't remember her being there. And I remember just thinking like, whoa, do you do the truth or do you do the truth of your memory? So anyway, yes, it is fascinating. So maybe I'll shift gears a little bit and talk to you, Christopher, for a minute or two about fictionalizing some real lives. I loved your most recent novel, Leading Men, in which you tackled, you know, the real lives of some pretty highfalutin famous people. Tennessee Williams and cameo of Truman, or more than cameo, but Truman Capote and Frank Merlo. And I guess I'm really interested if you could tell me a bit about the kind of research you did for this novel, and then at what point did you sort of know you'd done enough so you could just let your imagination soar?
I mean, I think you can never do enough research. You know, that's sort of part of the problem, right? Is especially when you're starting out on a project like this, you can research for years and years and years, and as much as we want it to be, it's not writing. You know, it's not writing the book itself. And I spent a lot of time. Now I should say I knew from the beginning that I wasn't going to make Tennessee Williams a point of view character. And I was going to make his partner, Frank Merlo, who's much less well known, but was still a real person, the main point of view character. And I think that freed up a lot of the pressure to do tons and tons and tons of research way beyond, because the scholarship on Williams is vast. What he wrote about himself, his letters, his work itself is vast. And I also, after reading so much of that, I realized I didn't have anything to add to the conversation about him himself, which is why I didn't want to take him as a point of view character, which is the most privileged position you can give a character, right? Is to be in their heads. I really wanted to be in his partner's head. And there was comparatively very little that was written about him directly. So I read everything that there was, that I could find, his own letters, their letters back and forth, Williams's journals about their relationship, the letters that other people wrote about their relationship, and I talked to a guy who calls himself the last living lover of Tennessee Williams, and he talked about what Williams told him about about the sex life that he had with Frank. So I mean, we kind of like, so I got all this sort of information, but I should, to answer your question, when I started writing about the time where you start to get that, about the time I started to get that itch, like I had to kind of just be in the room with them in a way that I could make that were on my terms, right? And so I just kind of free wrote and really kind of messily went into the project, knowing full well that for the rest of the project it would be a concurrent process where I would write a little bit, I'd come up against some kind of problem or issue, I'd go back to doing some research, I'd come back, and then they would really go kind of back and forth or really concurrently throughout the process. And the last thing I'll say is that what would often happen is that I would write something and then find out I was wrong, that this thing couldn't possibly have happened, or that this isn't really how the character would have dealt with this or whatever. And I would and I would be so furious at first that I had gotten it wrong, and that I'd found out this other information. But in every case, having to go back and correct and figure out a way, like a workaround to get it right, always made it better. So that initial like frustration with, oh God, I have to figure out a way, it always made it better. And so that was heartening to me.
And so did you always have to stick to the facts, or could you allow yourself the fictional license if something were an inconvenient fact that derailed, you had this trajectory and this was going to keep you, or did you have to figure out the trajectory around the fact?
Right. I mean, different writers handle it differently, and there's no right way to do it. Like, I mean, there are writers, look at Curtis Sittenfeld's new book, right? She's writing about Hillary Clinton, who's very much alive, but about a total alternative history for her that definitely did not happen, right? And for me, for my project, I wanted to write it was very important to me that every single thing in that novel could have happened. And so I double and triple checked every date, every location that these characters were. And I was right where the fictional space was in the cracks between what wasn't known. Where, there's a week that's missing from Williams's journals, and that's the week that I set most of the action in the book. And so everything that happens during that week could have happened. And there's a whole piece that involves a film that really existed, we seem to have lost Adrienne. But it could have, but the role that the character could have played, he could have played that role in that film. It's just, we don't know whether he did or whether he didn't. There's a party they're invited to. We know they were invited. We don't know whether they actually went. So I had them go to see what would happen. So that's the way that was the terms that I set. And I know other authors, I mentioned Curtis Sittenfeld, but other authors, they deliberately wanted to warp the truth and to present a more counterfactual story, where this thing that couldn't possibly have happened or definitely didn't happen, they make happen in fiction as a way of getting toward a different kind of story truth, which we discussed earlier. I don't know if we've lost Adrienne or.
Well, Steve, maybe you can answer too what you think of memory and how I'm just going to jump in here.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Well,
How have you handled memory or composites or time, time crunches?
Well, to talk about memory, the central thing I've recognized after lots of thinking about it and writing and therapy and the rest of it is memory is created. Memory isn't a transcription of what happened. Memory is the past is filtered through the emotional and psychological needs of your present. When I was 10 years old, I remember being in a field in Hollister hitting dirt clods with an aluminum bat. And because my older brother was I worshiped him, but he was also mean to me. Even on my backswing, I smashed him in the mouth. And I remember turning around and this geyser of blood coming out of his mouth and feeling like, wow, my subconscious rage at this guy, caused me to bash him in the head. I carried that story around for 30 or 40 years and wrote, terrible poems and stories about that. And I finally sent one off to my brother, who said, that's not how it happened at all. In fact, I'd been warned many times not to step into the path of that. It was my recklessness. It was something I inflicted on myself. And so you ask yourself, what is the truth of that episode? And you go, well, the truth is the blood. The truth is the scar that my brother wears on his upper lip. That is true. That's all we can say. And the rest of it is a sort of radically subjective version of events that we can agree objectively took place. I try to put a proviso at the beginning of all my books saying, basically, like, one of the books is like, all this happened many bongs ago. And so the vagaries of memory this is just as I remember it, but everything that I remember did take place. I don't know that, and when I write through something, I do a similar version to what it sounds like Claire does frequently, which is to say, this is my recollection of it. This is my version. And also to recognize that your fantasies about how it might have gone, your shifting memories as to how it went, are also a part of the story. We want to treat memory like something that we can, sort of wrestle down and have be one way. But the truth is, like that story you told, it's shifting all the time. Danny Shapiro's, memory, one moment is like this and it shifts, and we don't even know why. That's the mystery of the subconscious acting on the conscious mind. So I try to basically put a qualifier, because I feel like your job is to have a good faith contract with the reader. If you have composite characters, if you have time shifts, if you've messed around with the chronology, you should tell the reader up front, or even, as Chris is suggesting, put the problem in the poem, as Robert Haas says. Don't treat the fact that it's problematic as something that you have to sort of elide or get around, but actually engage with it and say, what's the potential of this particular problem? What's the significance of my trying to jam it into this time frame?
Hi, everyone.
He's back.
Welcome back.
I'm back. I thought all three of you went, which is the
That's
funny
what I'm
other
talking
part
about.
of it.
In
So,
your memory of this, that's the way it's going to be. Then they just disappeared, and the panelists will have another memory, and we'll have another memory.
All right. Well, I gather you've we finished up on Christopher. Just trying to keep up here now. So maybe I'll ask you a couple questions, Steve, unless you've already answered all of them while I was gone.
Turn on a light.
I have read, as you know, so many of your books, and I published some of your stories back in the day at Zoetrope. And I remember thinking even then that you were kind of the master of the fluid relationship between actual events / real people and the fictional universe. And I'm also a huge fan of your nonfiction, which is very personal, but let's start with your fiction. And maybe this isn't so different with the creative nonfiction or the memoir, but what do you think the author's responsibility to protect the identity of the real person who might have inspired the character?
I think it's a shifting line. And so I'll just give a couple of examples of places where I feel I wrote a good piece that I stand by, and I also hurt somebody, and that also is a part of the story. So in one of my nonfiction books, I played as sort of a funny episode, kind of becoming disappointed in somebody and writing somebody off as a romantic prospect because of the kind of music they listen to. And I played it as a joke, but it wasn't a joke either to her or to me at the time. And I trivialized that to be clever. And, that's always a racket when you're trying to be clever. I can also think of another story that was in my first story collection. And even though I changed the names and locations and everything was changed, and even though there are probably 3 people on earth who know that that is based on a relationship that I had, one of those people is the person I had the relationship with. And when I sent her the story, she was living in a foreign country. Nobody was ever going to read this piece of fiction, this obscure short story by an obscure writer. But she had lived some version of that. And seeing that private set of experiences both wrestled onto the page in the naked light of day, and also, with me giving myself the privilege of telling this story, she was absolutely gobsmacked and betrayed by that. She said, how could you possibly write about such a thing? It's unforgivable to me. Both that I would expose it, in the first place, and that I would kind of revisit it as quote unquote material. I have no answer to that. In other words, I can't justify that and say, well, but my artistic prerogative makes it okay. No, that's what it is maybe that story has been a comfort to some people. I stand by it as a piece of work where I was proceeding toward the truth with mercy. I was the me character was the main person who messed up in many ways. It was a reckoning story for the me character, but it was still profoundly hurtful to her. And I don't think there's any way to rationalize that. That's not our job to sort of say, well, yes, but I'm the artist. When you grant yourself the privilege of being the person who tells the story, then you take the responsibility of who that story affects and the ways in which it affects them.
Right. And are there stories that now with, maturity and age you would do differently?
Oh yeah, like the one I talked about where I played something as comic. The other thing that's fascinating about all this, I wrote a short story that you published, I think, at Zoetrope called Among the Eek. Now that story was
I
about
remember that story.
Yeah, I mean, it was about a strange episode that took place in my life where I visited a house and there was a friend of mine and his father was there and his mother had just died. So the father was feeling very cut off and isolated from the family and kind of cornered me, the guest, in the kitchen and sort of told me all about this strange, upsetting event in his past that really had to do with his obsession with or thinking about death. It was part of his mourning. So I wrote that whole story because that episode stuck in my mind. And I think our job is to write about what we can't get rid of by other means. That's what our material is, the stuff that has business with us. And so I wrote about that episode, and eventually the book came out with Among the Eek in it. And my dad, who's a smart and thoughtful guy and pretty narcissistically well defended, I'll say, read the book and wrote me a nice letter saying, gee, your mother and I got your book and it's a lot dirtier than we thought. And there's certain relatives who we wouldn't want to have read it. But I just want to say about that story, Among the Eek, I recognize, I didn't realize how emotionally distant I was as a father. And, I reared back in astonishment and said, oh my God, what are you talking about? That story wasn't about, of course it was about him. It was about a kind of father who sort of used the mom, his wife, as a way of connecting with the family and who was somewhat cut off from the family emotionally. That's why that story had stuck in my head and why I started writing the piece of fiction about it. So oftentimes we have no idea what we're writing about. And I think in fiction, it's our job to not have any idea. We shouldn't be psychoanalyzing it and trying to figure it out. We should just be saying, what has caught in my mind? And let me write about that without thinking about what the deeper motives are.
Okay, that is a lot to think about. And I also remember, well, I don't want to get off track, but like the evil BB Chow, I feel like I remember some characters in that story. But anyway, just turning to your nonfiction for a moment, and I don't know if you talked about this while I was gone, because when I came back, you were saying something, but there is, I want to get this quote right, because you once described creative nonfiction as a, quote, radically subjective account of events that objectively took place.
Right.
And I just think it's the most brilliant, brilliant little description. And I'm just curious if you want to say any more about that.
Only that it's very important in this moment of a kind of epistemological breach where we have major demagogues and political actors literally undermining our democracy by saying there is no real truth or I have my set of facts, to say, well, no, there is no such thing as emotional. I mean, there might be a set of feelings, but that is separate and apart from the truth of what events transpired. And to some extent, who is morally responsible for what was said and done. And I think it's a really slippery slope. James Frey, wrote a novel with all kinds of sort of stuff that wasn't really realistic to the story that he had to tell. And he's a talented enough writer, frankly, that he could have told the story of his own descent into addiction. And he didn't have to include all the Hollywood elements and the stuff that's less realistic. But he did the false advertising that I think is inexcusable, especially in this moment, where he consciously was making things up. And he knew that the events objectively hadn't taken place in that way. and yet he portrayed it as nonfiction. And that, to me, especially in this moment, where we have our epistemology is breaking down as a culture, we have to say memory is a created thing, and everybody's moving through their own story in a radically subjective way. But there are events that objectively took place, and we have to be able to agree. We cannot sort of lower our defense and say, well, whatever you feel like is true becomes true, because it's not just dangerous and ineffective in the fictional world or in the world of creative writing, it is disastrous to the democracy.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I also recently read your book, Bad Stories, What the Hell Just Happened to Our Country, which was your effort to make sense of this historical moment and our need to confront our cultural delusions. And there was so much to admire about this book. But for the purposes of this conversation, writing about real people, you did one of the kind of gutsiest things ever, which was you wrote about the politics of your in-laws.
Yeah.
And I want to know if you hesitated or thought twice about that, or what exactly, what was that about? That was brave.
Yeah, it was partly about, well, I knew they'd never read it.
Oh, okay.
So there you go. I mean, if I was a Fox News pundit, they might have read it, but they might read it. And honestly, what I had to say was, hey, if you are my mother-in-law, and to you, the life of an unborn child is sacred, and it is an atrocity and a crime against the kingdom of man and God, for women to have the reproductive rights and to exercise them in that way. Well, then she is, by her own code of living, morally bound to support candidates who will, stand against that atrocity. In other words, I didn't write about them to say, gee, I don't understand them, they're just irrational. It was more to say, hey, from her point of view, she's doing what she has to.
Right.
And like anytime, even especially in a book like Bad Stories, the worst thing could have been to say, I stand in judgment. It never works. It's not going to work this fall. It never works to stand in judgment of people. They just, anytime you're trying to strong arm the reader as a writer, it never works. People always get that you're trying to control them and trying to get them to think a certain way, and that you're making rhetoric. So my challenge in that book was to write in a clear-eyed way about the forces that I think led to this, and then sort of through a literary lens, and to say, don't you understand? We've been living Moby Dick. We are following the path of one man's male wounded aggression. And whenever you do that, the ship is going to go down, and everybody's going to go down with it when the culture consents to that narrative. But I didn't want to be judgmental. Like, there's a moment after the election where there's a dad who I see at the pool, and me and my kids see him, and we have this wonderful moment of dad bonding because he's got a little girl who's eating potato chips, and I'm like, that's my little girl. She's not going to stop when you say to stop. She's going to speed up her rate of chip consumption. And a few minutes later, my son says, look at that man, and it's the same guy, and he's wearing a Make America Great Again hat. Wow. And he expects me, my son, to sort of go, ugh, how could he, or to cast judgment on him. But I have no idea what story that guy has led. I don't have the faintest clue. I know what we have in common, which is we're both dads on vacation at the mercy of our little daughters. And beyond that, it's all conjecture. And if I start to assume the position of moral authority or knowing about him or judging him, I'm actually no better than anybody who we might rail against. We have to be what I call the fools in charge of forgiveness. Like, that's our job right now. And I think that really applies, or sort of bends around to this idea of our job as writers is to proceed toward the truth, but in mercy, always in mercy, not going there to settle scores, as Claire said, or somehow to kind of arrange history so that we're the hero or the victim.
Right, right. Well, I think it's almost time to turn it over to the audience questions. So I'm just scrolling through right now. And Claire, I have one for you. The first question is, Claire, since you had a professional relationship with the clients that you've written about, did you feel the need to get permission from them or let them know you were undertaking the writing?
I did get permission from all of them. I still disguised their names and identifying characteristics, and just changed a few things so that you couldn't pick them out. But I did get permission from all of them. And so that was important to me. And it ended up being important to them. They were they were all the people I approached, and I knew the right clients to approach. I knew who would probably be okay about it. And they felt just kind of validated in their story being important and their story being necessary and important into imparting what I was trying to talk about in terms of the correlation between anxiety and grief, which was kind of something new that I was trying to bring out. And so it was important to me, though, yes, to get their permission and have them feel okay about it.
And did anyone say no, just out of curiosity?
No, but again, I only went to clients that I thought would be okay with it. I feel so sensitive with my clients that I didn't want to ask anyone I thought might find that, jarring or
right.
some kind of, yeah.
Okay, so I have a question too, which is for anyone. Oh, and I feel like I can relate to this. I have a modern love essay coming out this week and I'm feeling acute exposure anxiety. Any tips for letting it all roll off my back? This is my first piece with this kind of platform. And I have to say, one of the questions I was going to ask all of you are, when are you most anxious about is it the writing process? Is it when you're done? Is it a week before it comes out? But let's respond to this person with the modern love essay upon him or her exposure anxiety. What tips do we have from people?
Brace yourself. No. I don't know. I feel like I've received a fair amount of criticism on my personal life here and there. And my take is usually that the people who take the time to write lengthy criticisms online are usually pretty unhappy themselves. Sometimes there's things to note about them, things to think about for yourself. But for the most part, I really think that, people who are just going out with writing for the first time and exposing themselves in that way have got to really let it try to roll off their backs. It's going to happen no matter what. Steve, Christopher, I'm sure you guys have a lot to say about it too.
I don't know if I have a lot to say, but I would say that I did think that it would get easier, that in terms of, after I published a few things that I would be less upset or feel less vulnerable or feel less wounded but it really, it doesn't. So in a weird way, I hope that's, I don't know if that's comforting, but at least it's realistic not to expect that. So if you don't, my point is, if as you go on as a writer and you don't feel less wounded, that's okay. In fact, you feel more wounded, that's okay. That actually means, I feel like the more vulnerable you feel, that means the closer you are to the work, the more the work means to you, and that means you're doing the work you need to do. If it didn't bother you what people said about the art you were creating, then what kind of artist are you?
Right. I mean, the central thing is this. I think her name is Tara. Like, Tara, congratulations. This is one of the hardest things to do, is to place a column in that newspaper. Their filtering is exquisite. They're not going to let you be exploitative and get away with kind of cutting corners emotionally or psychologically. So the fact that you're there is a monumental achievement. And your job, and I really honestly mean this, is to try to enjoy it. Because if you set up a situation where you do not enjoy a huge accomplishment like that, you are left with nothing but failure. And that is most of writing, as I'm sure everybody will attest to. Like, most of writing is having projects or moments in where you're going after something where you're full of doubt and uncertainty. This is a moment where you not only have gotten something published, but something published at the highest level. Lots of people are going to read it. Some people are going to be wound up by it, and that's a compliment in an odd way. Other people are going to be so thankful that you wrote it. You're going to cling on to whoever it is who says nasty things in the comment box, but please try not to. It's such a self-punishing way to go through life. This is a moment to be incredibly proud about. And I think writers in general sort of go, kind of like Chris is saying, we kind of make the worst of the good news. We're actually quite inhibited about and fearful of success and allowing ourselves to feel a sense of accomplishment. But like, try to, because this is a wonderful moment. You should, we'll buy you a drink.
Yes, do it for all of us.
Right. We would love to have him such an essay. Yeah.
Yeah. Steve, thank you for that.
That was great. All right, another question. Any insight, direction on recreating dialogue from the past in the framework of memoir? How do you make sure your current perspective doesn't infiltrate a past conversation you are recreating? Any takers?
What do you think, guys?
I mean,
Thankfully, I don't write memoir.
well, but I'm sure it's sort of the same. Well, I think it's probably the same with some fiction. I don't think you can keep your current perspective entirely out, but that your job always is to be as truthful to how it would have been then, because you don't actually want to write a scene from when you were 15 years old with your knowledge as a 50-year-old. You want to write the truth of the scene as it was. And of course, like, none of us are going to be able to remember half an hour after this Zoom the actual words that we said. So it's about getting the spirit of it right, not the actual words.
Absolutely. I think it's like the conversation we were having about memory. Like, sometimes with dialogue, I will say things like, this is what I remember he said, or this is how I remember I felt after this conversation, without even relaying the conversation itself, just talking about my experience of it. Dialogue's tricky. I have a hard time with dialogue. I try to avoid it, which I think is okay. You know, other people I think are great at dialogue.
It's a bunch of quiet characters.
Yeah, it's hard. Dialogue's hard because you don't really remember exact conversations. If you're honest, what you remember is more, as Claire's saying, kind of a feeling or a mood or a moment during a conversation. So there's always a little bit of fudging, and I think the idea is to be upfront about that and to say, you know, look, this is how I remember it having been. And I will also say, like, you know, a conversation, something like this ensued, so that I give myself a little bit of wiggle room to honestly say, I did not have a tape recorder. This is what I remember of it, which is just as interesting.
Mm-hmm. At the same time, though, I feel like when a reader, and I don't write memoirs, so please correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, I feel like, you know, this is maybe obvious, but the best memoirs read in some ways like novels, and you feel like you're a part of that dream, right? And you don't want things to be constantly questioned. Like, this is how I remember. I mean, I understand when you're doing that in certain places, but you also want the reader to go along with you and believe the dialogue and almost forget that this is being constructed from a different time. So I feel like you should have the license and the sort of liberty to recreate it as much as possible. And then, you know, in an author note or something, explain, you know, I recreated the dialogue as best I could, et cetera, et cetera. But again, your job is to get the reader to feel like they're there in the most authentic way as you can.
I think that's a great.
For a fiction writer, I'd say that was excellent. No, but I think it's really important to give yourself that agency, because for the most part in memoir, you're writing about the people very close to you. And, you know, it's not as if I know what my mother would say in every situation, but I feel like I know what she might say in a lot of situations, and same for, you know, the people we're most intimate with. Okay, so we have just a few more minutes. Let me find one more question. Do any of you ever interview the people who you are writing about to get their point of view or memory of an event? Steve?
I do. I absolutely do. Somebody sent a question. They couldn't understand a word that I said. So the word was forgiveness. So that's, I was answering. Yeah, because it's fascinating. I mean, that's always a little bit terrifying, because it's a tricky thing when you have something that you're working on, especially if it's nonfiction. And I'm sure, you know, Adrienne, you and Claire can speak to this, and probably Chris can too, even though he doesn't write nonfiction supposedly. Yeah. You know, when you're the person telling the story, it's not a joint endeavor, and you have to be very clear as to, when you talk with somebody, what that means. That doesn't mean you are now co-authors, or you have to come to an arrangement with them so that they don't think they then get the right to edit what you've written, or to somehow get in the very precarious process of moving that from a manuscript into something that's going to enter the world. And I'm saying that not to be jerky, but because it is pretty precarious when you're especially working on stuff that has the feeling that it's going to be exposing. I have certainly asked my brothers or my mom or my dad or, you know, friends. Our friend Jessica Vickers talk about the evil BB Chow. She told me that crazy story and I kind of took it and ran. But I remember sending it to her because that was a case where I'd really taken her story and put
Right.
my spin on it. And I wanted to know, not just did I get it right, did I get it emotionally right? More than the facts, did I get the emotion of that experience right? And I was, if she had said, no, you didn't, or it's, you know, it's screwed up, I probably would have said, okay, I'm not going to try to put that in the world because I'm going to lose an important relationship. But there are other cases where I'm much more, I want to hear, I know there are limits to what I remember of something. And it's fascinating to hear somebody else's, to step into their reality. And it can be very helpful for the work. You're traveling just down like Emma Woodhouse. You've got your blind spots. You just see the world from your point of view. And the world's job, in a sense, is to point out your blind spots to you. And I think that's a good thing to do, especially with other people who are in the room. But you have to make sure the terms of why you're asking them are clear to both of you, so they don't think they suddenly have a kind of a co-authorship or the right to censor something if they don't like it.
Yeah.
I love that. I would also just quickly add that it's also helpful sometimes to do a lot of the writing about it before you talk to them, so that you have written, you know,
Right.
on it, your feelings about it, and then you can go back and revise. But if you talk to them first, you may not write what you really wanted to write in the first place.
That's right. Yeah, I
Yeah.
think that's so crucial. Yeah.
Really important news. Well, shockingly, it's 8:30, and we're already out of time. And I can't believe we're not all in Aspen together, that we're not all going to go out for a drink together after this. But thank you so much to our fabulous panelists, Steve Almond, Christopher Castellani, Claire Bidwell Smith. We have one more Summer Words panel on Monday evening, and the registration link is posted in the chat, and we hope you'll join us for another great literary conversation. And thanks again, and good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Adrienne.
All right,
Thanks,
guys.
Steve.
Good to
Thanks,
see you
Claire.
guys.
Thank you, everybody.
Mhm.